Hey, so how many of you hunting game fans out there like the Toukiden franchise? You know, Toukiden Age of Demons, Toukiden Kiwami, or Toukiden, or however you pronounce it. I was really a big fan of it, and I hope you are too, because we've got more Toukiden on the way. Today, the next entry of the series released, so now we're going to dive into it and see what it's all about. So here is my review of the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation TV version of Toukiden 2. In the world of Toukiden, there was an event known as the Awakening, where Oni appeared all over the world as huge monsters and laid waste to all of human civilization. The game starts at the very first battle of the Awakening, where you as a Slayer are fighting off and defending a city. But then you fall into a portal and wake up near a village 10 years later, which is actually 2 years after the events of Age of Demons and Kiwami. You then start helping the village defend against Oni, explore the areas around it, and all around just trying to figure out who you are and to reclaim your memories. Now, there are two things that I really love about the story of Toukiden 2. First of all is the charisma of all the characters. Only 2 playable characters returned from the first game, but everybody has so much character, so much backstory, and everyone is just so likable that I just fell in love with the cast. Especially the professor character who you meet at the very beginning of the game. The other thing is all of the backstory. You find out a ton of plot points about the series. What the Oni are, where they came from, and how the Awakening ended up happening in the first place. There's a little bit of convoluted stuff thrown in there with all the time travel, with you traveling from the original Awakening to 10 years later, but it's really got an in-depth perspective on story. T2 is an open-world hunting RPG. So basically imagine a hunter, but instead of enclosed missions, you can freely roam around wherever you want and fight enemies however you want. But before I get into the in-depth part of the overworld, let's talk about what's new outside of the open world perspective. Obviously there's new enemies, new weapons, new skills, new weapon types, and the Demon Hand subweapon. The enemy count is noticeable because when Toukiden Kiwami came out, there weren't really that many new enemies. In Toukiden 2, I would say about half of the enemies are returning from the first game, and about half of the enemies are new, mostly boss enemies. So there's a pretty fair variety, and most of the returning bosses are in optional missions and not actually part of the storyline. Now let's get back to the open world. When you leave the village, you can freely roam around into this huge open world map. There are no load times, you just walk, keep walking, keep walking, and keep walking. Some areas are closed due to story reasons, but overall you can just freely explore, fight enemies, find NPCs to do side quests for, go collect materials from bosses, and do whatever you want. But it's also really tied into the story. Every time the story has a new objective, you will get a marker on your map, and you need to go to that marker to push the story forward, whether it's finding a boss, collecting a certain Mitama, rescuing an NPC. But the main thing here is you don't have to do missions for it. It really just gives the game an entirely new feel. Now, as far as customization is concerned, you have your typical collect materials to forge and enhance weapons and armor, and you also have a few new things for Mitama. Mitama give you skills that you can use in combat, but they also level up and can get boosts, which fill up slots on armor that gives you further enhancements. And then finally we need to talk about combat, because that is where one of the biggest changes is outside of the open world. Roaming around the world, you do combat, and aside from the new weapon types, combat hasn't changed that much since the first game. With the rifle, my weapon of choice, you still aim and fire, you still have separate bullet types, and you still have rifles that only give you certain types available as long as that specific weapon is equipped. The Demon Hand subweapon is where things change a little bit. This is like a grappling hook, similar to the thorns from Freedom Wars. You can aim them at the enemy and launch them at a specific enemy body part. Now you can use these to grapple and jump up to do aerial attacks, or you could grapple onto them and try to pull them down like you can in Freedom Wars. But the big thing is the unity gauge. In the original game, when you filled up the unity gauge from combat, you could initiate a powerful group attack with the other characters in your party to do massive damage to the enemy. In this game, the demon hand uses this. When the unity gauge is full, aim your demon hand at a body part, you'll latch onto it, then put in a button to do a massive punching attack that not only sends the enemy flying, but has a high chance of ripping off a body part for you to collect. It's similar to the way it was before, but a little different because it's easier. The grappling hook mechanic of the demon hand has a very long range, so you don't have to run up to the enemy to do it. But that's about all of the gameplay elements. One thing I want to make a note of is the lack of repetition. In the original game in Kiwami, you had to fight bosses, and then you had to refight the same bosses over and over and over again, and it was really repetitive. In this game, in the optional missions, yes, you do refight a lot of bosses. But in the matter of the storyline, I think there were only 2 cases where I refought a boss I had fought earlier in the game. So if you just do the story, there pretty much is no repetition. Now finally, let's talk about difficulty and length. Now this might be because I played a lot of Toukiden Kiwami, but Toukiden 2 didn't really have a high difficulty for me. I mean, I used the rifle, and overall, I very rarely ran out of health outside of the environmental condition, the radiation like miasma that you get when you're exploring the open world. But as far as dying from boss fights, there aren't any missions that require you to go solo against the boss. And overall, I really didn't have a huge amount of problems with all the bosses outside of the high difficulty post-game bosses you get after you complete the story. And with length, we basically got 2 perspectives for length. Now let's say if you want to do only story, you don't want to do any side quests, you just want to rush through the story and get it over with. If you do that, you can probably beat the game in about 17 hours. Now, if you want to just do occasional missions, like let's say between story events, like maybe 1 or 2 missions instead of all 6 or 7 in the set for that chapter. Doing it like that, and you'll probably finish the game in about 25 to 30 hours. And if you want to be a completionist, you're looking more at 40 or 50 hours. I would say the average person who's not trying to rush through the game would be able to complete it in about 26, 27 hours, give or take. Now let's talk about controls, because I normally do not talk about controls in my video reviews. One control in particular, the Demon Hand. When you're playing on the PlayStation Vita, you aim the hand by holding down the touchscreen and moving your right analog stick to aim. And on the PlayStation TV, you do this with the R2 button. The main problem, the aiming is, not to be blunt, but it's terrible on the Vita. When you're on the PlayStation TV and hold down the R button and aim with the Demon Hand, what you're looking at in the middle of your screen immediately registers as a target. On the Vita, it doesn't. You have to rotate the camera until the target is actually in the bottom left corner of your screen, where some of it is even off screen before the target will register. This happened across the entire game. Now, if you're a PlayStation TV owner, you don't have anything to worry about. But Vita owners will have a very, very big inconvenience with this. Now let's go to presentation. Visually, I'm sure you can already tell what the graphics are like. The actual character models and boss models are about like they were in the previous game, but all of the environments have gotten a severe downgrade. There is very little detail. The sky looks almost like a plain color. Now at first you think, okay, they down the environments to up the performance, because this is an open world game on the PlayStation Vita. That doesn't pan out either. When you're running through the game, whether you are running around an open world, on an enclosed mission, or just walking around your base, I would say the game has an average frame rate of 20 to 25 frames per second. Every once in a while you'll jump up to 30 frames per second, sometimes during cutscenes or during exploration, and sometimes if you got a map full of enemies, you'll drop down to about 17 or 18 frames per second for a couple seconds, then back up to around 20 to 25. Now this isn't game breaking, but it is very noticeable, especially on the PlayStation TV. In conclusion, Toukiden 2 is really a big breath of fresh air over the entire hunting genre. The open world exploration and less focus on enclosed missions really helps the experience feel fresh and void of repetition, something that the first Toukiden was really criticized for. There are some issues with how the Vita controls the demon hand, the graphics, and the performance, but this is still one of my favorite hunting games that's available on the Vita, and fans of the original should definitely look into it. Reviews to Go rates Toukiden 2 a 7 out of 10. If you wish to comment on this further, feel free to below or head to the website at www.reviewstogo.com.